Hi, so let's talk about independent and dependent variables. After first reading about variables, some people may find a difficult time understanding them. Variables are given a specific name that only applies to experimental investigations. One is called the dependent variable and the other is called independent variable. Now, the independent variable is the variable that the experimenter changes or controls and is assumed to have a direct effect on the dependent variable. Two examples of common independent variables are gender and education level, because they generally don't change. Now, the dependent variable is the variable that's being tested and measured in the experiment and is dependent on the independent variable. An example of a dependent variable is depression symptoms, which depends on the independent variable of the type of therapy. In an experiment, the researcher is looking for the possible effects on the dependent variable that might be caused by changing the independent variable. Examples of independent and dependent variables in experiments can vary, and I've provided an example for this on your screen here. For example, we might change the type of information, either organized or random, given to participants to see what effect this might have on the amount of information that they remember. In this particular example, the type of information is the independent variable because it changes. And the amount of information remembered is the dependent variable because it's being measured. So, what does it mean to operationalize a variable? It's very important in psychological research to clearly define what you mean by both your independent and dependent variables. Operational variables, or operationalizing definitions, refers to how you will define the measure in a specific variable as it's used in your study. A good example of this would be if we were concerned with the effect of media violence on aggression. Then we would need to be clear on what we mean by the different terms. In this case, we must state what we mean by the terms media violence and aggression, as we will study them. Therefore, you could state that media violence is operationally defined in your experiment as exposure to a 15-minute film showing scenes of physical assault. Aggression is operationally defined as levels of electric shocks that are administered to a second participant in another room, because one caused the other, right? In another example, the hypothesis, young participants will have significantly better memories than older participants, is not operationalized. So how do we define young, or old, or even memory? How about this? Participants aged between 16 and 30 will recall significantly more nouns from a list of 20 than participants aged between 55 and 70. This is operationalized because we have clear definitions, right? The key point here is that we have made absolutely clear what we mean by the terms as they were studied and measured in our experiment. If we didn't do this, then it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to compare these findings of different studies into the same behavior. Operationalization has the great advantage that it generally provides a clear and objective definition of even complex variables. It also makes it easy for other researchers to replicate a study and check for reliability. So now when you're creating your hypothesis with your groups or your projects, consider how you are going to be specific and describe your variables in a way that they can be measured.